The buzzing stillness of a hot June evening in Springfield, Missouri, was interrupted not by screams or sirens, but by the cold, blinking glow of a Facebook notification. The post came from Claudinia Dee Dee Blanchard's account, and it was jarring, to say the least. "That bitch is dead," it read. Sharp. Shocking. No one knew what to make of it. The neighborhood knew Dee Dee. They adored her. She was the mother of a severely disabled girl, Gypsy Rose, a child frozen in time, with wide eyes, a toothy smile, and a list of chronic illnesses that seemed too cruel to be real. Dee Dee was tireless, her love unwavering. At least, that's what they believed. The second post hit harder. It was crude, laced with language so vile it seemed alien to the sweet, pink-clad woman they knew. But this wasn't just profanity. It was a confession. A declaration of violence, boasting of death and defilement. Neighbors were stunned, disturbed. Some dismissed it as a cruel hack. Others feared something far worse. When police arrived at the Blanchard home, all was quiet. The house sat in eerie stillness, blinds drawn tight. The front door was locked. Dee Dee's car was still in the driveway. But there was no answer, no movement. With permission from the property manager, officers forced their way in. Inside, a silence hung thick in the air. The living room, plastered with stuffed animals and medical supplies, looked untouched. In the back bedroom, the source of the smell hit them like a wall, cloying, unmistakable decay. On the bed lay Dee Dee Blanchard, face down, blood dried into the sheets, her body bloated from 5 days of decomposition. The violent nature of her death was immediately evident. She had been stabbed repeatedly. But the horror didn't end there. Her daughter, Gypsy Rose, was missing. Panic bloomed. Police feared a kidnapping. After all, Gypsy was vulnerable. She had leukemia. Muscular dystrophy. She couldn't walk or eat without assistance. Without her feeding tube, without her medication, she wouldn't last long. Every second counted. But hours later, a lead broke. Investigators traced the IP address from Dee Dee's Facebook posts to Big Bend, Wisconsin. Acting quickly, local law enforcement there raided a small home and found Gypsy Rose, alive, unharmed, and very much unlike the girl they had expected. She was walking. She was talking clearly. She looked healthy. Nicholas Godejohn, a quiet, socially awkward man in his 20s, was with her. And within hours, both he and Gypsy were in custody. What followed would become one of the most twisted, disturbing, and surreal true crime stories in recent memory. The interrogation room buzzed under cold fluorescent lights. The image of Gypsy, now stripped of her childlike persona, standing on her own 2 feet, stunned officers. And as the interviews unfolded, so did the truth: Gypsy hadn't been kidnapped. She had planned her mother's murder. The public watched in disbelief as the real story came to light. For years, Dee Dee had portrayed Gypsy as terminally ill. She insisted Gypsy had the mind of a child. That she suffered from dozens of conditions: cancer, epilepsy, vision and hearing loss, a chromosomal defect. She made sure Gypsy used a wheelchair, wore oxygen tubes, and kept her head shaved to mimic chemotherapy. Their home was a shrine to sickness, medical equipment, hospital bills, endless prescriptions. But it was all a lie. Dee Dee was suffering from a mental illness known as factitious disorder imposed on another, previously called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It drove her to fabricate or induce illness in her daughter to gain attention, sympathy, and financial support. And she succeeded. The pair had lived rent-free in a donated Habitat for Humanity house. They'd received trips, gifts, donations, and were often the focus of community fundraisers. Dee Dee was hailed as a hero, a single mother caring for a child with impossible odds. But Gypsy was a prisoner, trapped in a fantasy of sickness and suffering, punished whenever she questioned it. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She wasn't allowed to speak to doctors alone. Dee Dee doctored medical records, forged birth certificates, and relocated frequently, avoiding suspicion. Some doctors had their doubts, yes. But none had proof. And in the face of Dee Dee's elaborate web of lies, they remained silent. Gypsy's world was tightly controlled, until she got access to the internet. In secret, she began chatting on a shared laptop, eventually creating a Facebook profile under a fake name. It was through an online Christian dating site that she met Nicholas Godejohn. He lived in Wisconsin. He was odd, reclusive, and diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. But to Gypsy, he was a lifeline. Someone outside the house who believed her. Their online relationship turned romantic, then obsessive. Gypsy told Nicholas everything: the abuse, the lies, her desperate need to escape. She wanted to run. But she believed her mother would never let her go. In time, their private messages took a darker turn. She wanted Dee Dee gone. Nicholas agreed. The plan was simple and horrific. Nicholas would come to Springfield, kill Dee Dee, and the two of them would be free to live their lives together. Gypsy believed it was the only way. No more feeding tubes. No more lies. No more prison in pink walls and princess clothes. On June 10, 2015, Nicholas boarded a bus and made his way to Missouri. Gypsy bought him the ticket. She waited until Dee Dee was asleep, then unlocked the door and handed Nicholas gloves and a knife. While she hid in the bathroom, Nicholas entered the bedroom and attacked Dee Dee. The sounds from the room were brief, muffled. When it was over, Gypsy emerged. What happened next would further divide the world's opinion on the case. The two took several $100s from the house, then mailed the knife back to Wisconsin to avoid detection. They boarded a bus together and fled. For the next few days, they stayed in Nicholas's home, two fugitives wrapped in the fantasy of freedom. But freedom didn't last. The Facebook posts, meant as a twisted way to alert authorities and bring closure to the plan, backfired. The IP was traced, and the pair was arrested. When the public learned the truth, it was like waking from a dream. The child in the wheelchair had never needed one. The doting mother was not a martyr, but a manipulator. The murder was not random, but premeditated. The story was a house of cards, and it had finally collapsed. When news of Dee Dee Blanchard's murder spread, it felt like the town had been doused in ice water. The image of a helpless, terminally ill girl and her selfless caregiver mother had shattered in an instant. Friends, neighbors, even doctors found themselves staring at headlines they could barely comprehend. Everything they thought they knew had been a carefully crafted illusion. The story was more than shocking, it was grotesque. It was the betrayal of trust, the manipulation of empathy, and the calculated design of an alternate reality. Dee Dee hadn't just told little white lies. She had rewritten her daughter's life. And in doing so, she had orchestrated her own demise. As investigators combed through the Blanchard home, they uncovered a trail of deception as bizarre as it was disturbing. Medical records were inconsistent. Documents overlapped with multiple aliases. Prescription bottles were filled with unnecessary medications. Diagnoses were fabricated, symptoms exaggerated, and when one lie began to unravel, Dee Dee would simply move them to another state and start over. At the center of it all was Gypsy Rose. Stripped of her wigs, her wheelchair, and her childlike clothes, she was now a woman in her early 20s. No longer a porcelain doll of pity, Gypsy had become the most perplexing figure in the case, part victim, part accomplice. Her soft voice during interviews betrayed years of repression. And when she spoke, it became clear she had lived through a private nightmare. For Gypsy, reality had never been simple. Her mother controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, ate, thought, and said. If she questioned the stories, Dee Dee would threaten her, physically restrain her, or withhold food. Doctors who doubted the illnesses were blacklisted. Gypsy was taught never to speak during appointments. She was told she had the mind of a child. But inside, she knew something was wrong. She began to realize her body could do things her mother said it couldn't. She could stand. She could walk. She could think for herself. That awareness slowly became rage, a dangerous spark in the hands of someone who had never tasted autonomy. The psychiatric evaluation concluded what many had suspected. Gypsy was the victim of severe, long-term psychological abuse. She had been manipulated into believing she was sick her entire life. The condition, factitious disorder imposed on another, was at the heart of the case, but it was only part of the horror. What Gypsy endured was systemic, calculated, and endless. And now she had blood on her hands. Public opinion split. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer who plotted her mother's death in secret chats. Others viewed her as a desperate young woman who had been denied every normal experience a human being should have: education, relationships, freedom. Her supporters argued that Gypsy's actions were those of someone who had been backed into an invisible corner. Prosecutors had to walk a fine line. In 2016, after careful negotiation, Gypsy was offered a plea deal. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Many believed it was lenient. Others believed it wasn't nearly lenient enough. The media coverage turned Gypsy into a household name. News outlets across the country raced to tell her story. Soon, television networks and streaming platforms began adapting the case into documentaries, series, and dramatizations. The Act, Mommy Dead and Dearest, and countless podcasts retold the tale, each adding another lens to the events. But behind the headlines, Nicholas Godejohn was preparing to face his own reckoning. Unlike Gypsy, Nicholas had no history of abuse. He had lived with mental illness but not the manipulation or gaslighting that Gypsy had endured. Yet it was his hand that ended Dee Dee's life. He admitted to the stabbing. He never denied it. He believed he was doing something noble, rescuing the girl he loved from a monster. In court, his defense team painted him as a man with the mind of a child, easily influenced, emotionally unstable. But prosecutors saw something else: premeditation. The planning, the messages, the knife mailed home, all of it pointed to someone who had full awareness of his actions. The fact that he boarded a bus and crossed state lines with the sole intention of killing another person was impossible to ignore. The trial began in November 2018. Nicholas sat emotionless for most of the proceedings, often looking confused. Jurors listened to the graphic details of the crime, read the romanticized, sometimes disturbingly erotic messages between the couple, and heard the accounts of Gypsy's abuse. It was a murky web of love, delusion, and death. In the end, it didn't take long. Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the courtroom emptied that day, one thing was clear: no one walked away from this case unscarred. Back in Springfield, the pink house that had once drawn sympathy became a dark symbol. A tourist curiosity. A place locals didn't like to talk about. The walls that had witnessed so many years of abuse now stood silent, sun-bleached and empty. Behind bars, Gypsy adjusted to life in prison. She enrolled in classes. She read books. For the first time, she had a schedule she could follow, choices she could make. Paradoxically, she was free in a way she had never been before. Journalists and filmmakers who interviewed her noticed the same thing: Gypsy didn't speak with malice. She didn't defend what she had done, nor did she celebrate it. Instead, she described the life she had lost. The childhood stolen. The years spent pretending to die while secretly longing to live. And most hauntingly, she admitted she didn't wish her mother dead. She just didn't know how to stop her. Over time, the public's perception shifted. Gypsy was no longer just a headline, she became a cautionary tale. A tragic figure in a story too surreal for fiction. Parents, doctors, and mental health professionals debated the red flags that had been missed. Conversations about medical abuse, psychological manipulation, and systemic failure gained new relevance. The internet, once her only escape, had become the portal to her rescue and her downfall. The same space that gave her a voice also connected her to the man who would ultimately carry out her darkest wish. And yet, as the years passed, something unexpected began to happen. People began writing her letters. Thousands of them. Supporters, victims of abuse, curious strangers. Some offered forgiveness. Others shared their own stories of being controlled, silenced, or dismissed. In many ways, Gypsy became a symbol of silent suffering. Of the many who endure horrors behind closed doors, smiling through the pain, waiting for someone to notice. In 2023, after serving 8.5 years, Gypsy Blanchard was granted parole. She walked out of prison with a new name, a small suitcase, and an overwhelming amount of media attention. She had entered the world as a woman whose entire identity had been stolen. Now, she faced the impossible task of rebuilding it from scratch. The prison doors clicked open just after sunrise. For the first time in her adult life, Gypsy Blanchard walked freely into a world she had only seen through her mother's lens. 8.5 years behind bars hadn't dulled the media's interest. Paparazzi camped outside the gates. Reporters angled for a glimpse. But Gypsy didn't smile for cameras. She didn't wave. She just kept walking, quiet, purposeful, unreadable. To some, she was a convicted murderer. To others, a tragic survivor. But Gypsy knew what she was: someone trying to learn who she had always been, buried under years of manufactured illness, isolation, and control. Life after Dee Dee wasn't freedom, it was a slow, brutal excavation of self. The world she stepped into had changed. Social media painted her as everything from a monster to a martyr. Documentaries had immortalized her trauma. Her story had become a brand. But Gypsy was painfully aware of one thing: there was no version of her that wasn't touched by her mother's ghost. She spoke sparingly in early interviews, her voice soft but certain. She didn't flinch from the truth. "I wanted to escape," she said. "And I didn't know how." There was no guidebook for learning to live after pretending to die for most of your life. She had never driven a car. Never gone to a real school dance. Never tasted alcohol or felt what it meant to argue with someone without fearing they would drug her afterward. Her life, up to that point, had been a choreographed performance, acted out from a wheelchair, beneath a wig, with a mother's firm grip always nearby. Even in prison, she'd felt freer. And yet freedom, when it finally came, was confusing. It wasn't lined with celebration. It was loaded with grief. The public's obsession with Gypsy only grew. Offers poured in: book deals, podcast appearances, reality show pitches. The grotesque irony was clear: the world couldn't stop watching her, just as they hadn't looked closely enough when it would have made a difference. Behind closed doors, she wrestled with what the future should look like. How does one start from zero when their past is a crime scene? She enrolled in therapy. Began trauma work. But progress came in fragments. In her sessions, she described years of being wheeled into doctors' offices, warned to stick to the script. Of feeding tubes she didn't need, of shaved heads and 4 bags, of birthdays where she was reminded her life was a borrowed miracle. Dee Dee hadn't just lied to the world, she'd built a labyrinth in Gypsy's mind, where truth and fiction became indistinguishable. Reclaiming her identity meant revisiting each of those memories. Not to erase them, but to understand them. She cried often. Sometimes for Dee Dee, sometimes for herself. She hated her mother for the pain. She mourned her mother for the love she still, confusingly, felt. That was the paradox that haunted her. Because Dee Dee did love Gypsy, in her own twisted, suffocating way. Psychologists later dissected the relationship as a textbook case of enmeshment. Dee Dee hadn't seen Gypsy as a separate person, but as an extension of herself. The illnesses, the attention, the sympathy, it had all been a high she couldn't quit. And Gypsy? She had been the currency. The object. The means to an emotional end. The real tragedy, experts noted, was systemic. Teachers had raised concerns. Doctors had flagged inconsistencies. Social workers had been suspicious. But no one had the full picture. No one had connected the dots in time. A cascade of missed opportunities had left Gypsy trapped in a nightmare disguised as a charity case. As she settled into life outside prison, Gypsy attempted to form new relationships. One man, a former pen pal, became her fiancé. The engagement ended quietly. Then another surfaced, this time, a man from the real world, not behind bars. Their whirlwind romance unfolded publicly, giving some people hope and others concern. Had she really healed enough to trust someone? Or was she grasping for the idea of normalcy she'd never had? Gypsy herself admitted that the attention could be overwhelming. The internet dissected her every move, what she wore, what she said, who she dated. In many ways, the control hadn't ended when Dee Dee died. It had just been passed to the court of public opinion. But one thing remained clear, she wasn't pretending anymore. Gypsy began speaking to schools and organizations about psychological abuse. She wanted to educate people on the warning signs of factitious disorder imposed on another. Her story, horrific as it was, had the power to change how people viewed invisible abuse. She told audiences how important it was to believe children when they say something doesn't feel right. To question the overly rehearsed stories. To investigate the families that seem too perfect. To speak up, even when the consequences are uncomfortable. Some days were good. Others, less so. Trauma is never linear. Sometimes she would wake from dreams where she was still in the pink bedroom, tubes taped to her skin, Dee Dee hovering with a spoonful of crushed medication. Sometimes she felt guilt, not just for the murder, but for the way it ended. For not calling the police instead. For not finding another way. For surviving. But she didn't make excuses. "I'll live with what I did for the rest of my life," she told one interviewer. "But I'll also live, for the first time." The house on West Volunteer Way in Springfield still stands, though it's changed hands. People drive by, taking pictures, whispering about what happened there. But inside those walls, the screams are gone. The lies are gone. And so is the woman who built that illusion. In her place remains a complicated legacy, of abuse no one believed, of a girl who learned to lie just to survive, and of a crime that forced the world to reconsider how deeply trauma can twist the lines between victim and perpetrator. Gypsy Blanchard didn't just kill her mother. She killed the story Dee Dee forced the world to believe. And in doing so, she became the story no one would ever forget. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like the video and subscribe for more content like this.